The doctor was clapping his hands inches from my newborn son's face. The sound should have startled him. It didn't. Not a twitch, not a blink, not even a whimper. The room went utterly silent, as if the world itself had stopped listening. His father, the billionaire I served, laughed nervously, then snapped his fingers, called the baby's name, louder this time. Still nothing. I watched him freeze. The tension in the room was palpable. My heart pounded as I realized what the others hadn't yet admitted aloud. The doctor's smile faded. He stopped making noise and started writing. The words didn't need to be spoken. The diagnosis hovered in the air before anyone said it. This child lived in a world without sound. I stayed near the wall, trying not to draw attention. Maids aren't meant to react, aren't meant to exist in moments like these. But my eyes were glued to the baby, to the way his fingers curled when his mother brushed his arm. He didn't hear her voice, but he felt her touch. The diagnosis came softly. Congenital hearing loss, severe, likely permanent. The word deaf floated like something forbidden, something shameful, though it was nothing of the sort. The billionaire's jaw tightened. His mother's tears fell silently. Doctors spoke of specialists and technology, machines, sounds, percentages, but no one noticed what I did. When a metal tray slipped from a nurse's hand and clanged to the floor, Alexander didn't react. But when I stepped closer, letting the floor tremble beneath my feet, his fingers twitched, just for a second. That second was everything. That second told me this story wasn't going to end the way they thought. They named him Alexander, a name heavy with legacy, power, and expectation, not silence. The mansion adjusted instantly. Soundproof nurseries, imported specialists, the best equipment money could buy. But in all that, one truth remained unnoticed. Alexander was alive, aware, waiting for someone to speak in his language. And I knew that someone was me. The official words settled in the room like heavy stone. Alexander was profoundly deaf. The father's gaze drifted away, sharp and distant, retreating into a world of meetings, schedules, and walls of glass. His presence became rare, fleeting, just enough to remind everyone of authority, never enough to comfort his son. His mother tried. She sang softly, whispering words he couldn't hear. She pressed gentle hands to his small body, rocking, stroking, repeating phrases I knew he couldn't understand. Her eyes, red and swollen, pleaded with me silently for answers I couldn't give, answers only time, patience, and understanding could reveal. And so I stayed, quietly, observing, learning. Alexander didn't respond to voices, but he responded to movement, to intention, to presence. I discovered that when I approached slowly, letting him feel my approach through the floor, through vibrations in the crib, he would calm. When I rushed, when others tried, he stiffened. Doctors called it coincidence, reflex, stimulation, but I knew better. I had seen children like him before, children for whom silence was an emptiness, but a language waiting to be spoken, and I was going to be the one to speak it. Every night after the mansion hushed and its lights dimmed, I would sit by his crib. No words, no clapping, no snapping, just my hands on the crib rail, my palm on the mattress, steady rhythms, slow vibrations. When I tapped gently, Alexander would turn toward the source. When I stopped, he would relax, and for the first time, I saw a spark, a tiny flicker of understanding, recognition, and trust. By the time he was 6 months old, the word death had solidified in the house. It shaped conversations. It shaped distance. His father stopped asking questions, his mother's hope flickered, and the specialists were brought in, machines and charts replacing intuition. But I observed what the world around him didn't. Alexander understood presence, connection, and rhythm in ways no doctor could measure. One afternoon, a nurse dropped a stack of books. The clatter should have startled him. It didn't. But when I pressed my hand gently to the mattress, Alexander immediately turned to me. In that moment, I knew the world was not ready for him. Not yet, but I was, and I was going to make sure he thrived, even in silence. It happened quietly, almost imperceptibly one evening when the mansion had settled into its usual hush. Alexander lay in his crib, eyes wide but still, fingers twitching at the edges. I placed a small, broken music box on the mattress, a device that no longer played sound, only vibrations. I wound it slowly, letting its subtle tremors travel through the fabric beneath him. At first, nothing. Then a tiny movement. His fingers curled, then relaxed. His lips parted in what could only be described as a laugh, soft, breathy, almost disbelief itself, the first sound of joy in the room since the diagnosis. No one else noticed. The father was in the study, buried in papers. The mother had stepped away for a moment. I was alone with him, and that moment was ours. I held my breath. This wasn't a reflex. This wasn't coincidence. Alexander understood the vibrations. He felt the rhythm. He reacted deliberately. And for the first time, I knew with certainty that he wasn't lost to the world. He simply experienced it differently. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. The house had already decided his limits. Doctors had assigned labels. Machines had dictated schedules. But I had seen beyond all that, and I would continue to explore this hidden world with him. From that day forward, I developed a routine. Gentle taps on the crib rail, slow presses against the mattress, vibrations felt through his tiny arms and legs. Alexander responded every single time. Sometimes it was a flicker of movement, sometimes a small giggle, but always recognition. He knew I was there. Even his parents began to notice subtle changes. The mother would peek in, catching glimpses of his reactions when I moved nearby. The father remained skeptical, distant, yet the way Alexander's body stiffened or relaxed when I approached began to draw his attention, little by little. But I was careful. This was still our secret language. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mansion, Alexander shifted in his crib and reached toward the vibrations. My heart swelled. This was more than communication. This was connection. And I realized, quietly but firmly, that I had found the key to his world, a language no one had thought to use. The days passed slowly, yet every moment in that mansion felt stretched with tension and expectation. I watched the family closely, learning the patterns of their presence, their indifference, their unspoken judgments. The father barely entered the nursery now. When he did, it was a measured, almost mechanical glance before retreating back to his office. Meetings, calls, decisions. His love for Alexander was buried beneath schedules and obligations. The mother tried, desperately. She mirrored my movements, slowed her hands, softened her voice, even though he couldn't hear it. I noticed the exhaustion etched into her face, the way her shoulders drooped as if carrying the weight of both grief and hope. She wanted to reach him, to connect, but she was tethered to the conventional methods, the ones that hadn't worked. Alexander, meanwhile, watched and learned. His awareness of movement, intention, and touch grew sharper by the day. He knew when I approached without speaking. He knew when someone else tried and failed, and each failure by the world around him only made him more dependent on our quiet language, the rhythm we had begun to share. One afternoon, I observed him during a visit from a specialist. The room was filled with machines, charts, and papers. The doctors clapped, waved, and called his name repeatedly. Alexander remained still, unimpressed, unreactive. But when I pressed my hand gently to the mattress, he turned, eyes bright, fingers curling, his body shifting with recognition. No one else noticed. No one else would understand. It became clear that the mansion, with all its wealth and authority, had failed him. His parents were trying, but they didn't yet see him. Not really. And in their absence, I became his anchor, his interpreter, his bridge to a world he could not hear but could feel deeply. And yet, the tension in the household was palpable. Staff whispered about my presence, about the unusual attachment forming. The head housekeeper questioned my methods behind closed doors. I ignored it. Alexander's trust was worth more than approval from anyone in the mansion. I would not step back, not now. That night, as the mansion settled, I stood by his crib and watched him sleep. Tiny fingers curled, chest rising and falling in rhythm with the vibrations we shared. I whispered silently to myself, promising that no one, not even the walls of wealth and expectation, would silence him. It was a quiet evening when it happened, one of those rare moments when the mansion seemed suspended, holding its breath. Alexander had been restless, his small body fidgeting despite the mother's gentle attempts to soothe him. The father, who rarely spent more than a few minutes in the nursery, had appeared, unexpected, curious, and skeptical all at once. He watched from the doorway, arms crossed, jaw tight, as the nurses tried everything, rocking, toys, even the softest of sounds. Nothing worked. Alexander's tiny hands twitched, his eyes darted, his body stiffened. Frustration and confusion clouded his father's features. "Why can't anyone make him stop?" he finally demanded, voice clipped but heavy with a mix of anger and helplessness. I stepped forward, careful and deliberate. No words, no noise. I placed my palm gently against his chest and pressed slowly on the mattress, letting him feel the rhythm, the vibration. Tap, pause, tap, pause. Alexander's body immediately relaxed. His fingers grasped instinctively, curling around the edge of the crib, as if reaching for reassurance. His breathing slowed. Calm returned. The father's eyes widened. He stepped closer, but not too close. Fear and disbelief wrestled with curiosity. "He felt that," he whispered, almost to himself. His voice was quiet, cautious. "He responded." "Yes," I said softly, holding his gaze, "because he isn't lost to the world. He just experiences it differently." For the first time, the father lingered. He didn't speak, didn't question. He just watched, watching me, watching Alexander, watching something profound unfold that no wealth, no power, no specialist could explain. That night, for the first time, he stayed in the nursery longer than 5 minutes. He didn't touch his son. He didn't need to. He simply observed, slowly, deliberately, as if learning a language he never knew existed. And in that quiet observation, I saw a crack in his armor, a shift in his understanding. Alexander's world, once ignored and misjudged, had begun to reach him, and the first spark of connection between father and son, silent and unseen by the rest of the household, had begun. Over the next few weeks, a quiet routine took shape. Alexander and I developed a system, a language of vibrations, touches, and patterns that allowed him to communicate in ways no one else could understand. Tap once, he wanted me close. Tap twice, he needed reassurance. A slow press of the palm against the mattress signaled calm. Every movement carried meaning, and every subtle reaction from him was a word, a sentence, a story. The mother began noticing, tentatively at first. She would peek in as I guided his hands, matching my rhythm, teaching him patterns, demonstrating gentle touches. She copied me, slowly, hesitantly, afraid to disrupt the fragile trust that had formed. But Alexander responded to her, too, a flicker of recognition, a soft curl of his fingers. Hope began to seep into her voice again, fragile but growing. The father, though still distant, began observing more closely. He stayed longer in the nursery, leaning against the wall, silent but present. I caught him mimicking my slow, deliberate movements, subtle taps, light presses, rhythms across the crib. He didn't speak, but his eyes betrayed a shift. For the first time, he was learning, not commanding, not observing as an outsider, but truly learning. It wasn't easy. The staff whispered constantly, questioning my methods, doubting the validity of the patterns. The head housekeeper scowled. The nurses exchanged uneasy glances. But Alexander noticed none of it. He responded only to intention, to presence, to the consistency of our silent communication. And every time he reacted, the house shifted imperceptibly. The air became lighter, the tension eased, and authority subtly realigned around understanding, not control. By the end of the month, I began teaching the parents the basics. Simple patterns at first: tap, pause, tap, slow press, gentle stroke. The mother practiced alongside me, slowly becoming attuned to the rhythm and vibrations. Alexander rewarded her with small smiles and relaxed sighs. The father struggled, initially impatient, but he watched and repeated, hesitant, unsure. And then, one day, he tapped a simple pattern and Alexander responded instantly, curling his fingers around his hand. That moment broke something open, a connection neither of them had experienced before. The secret language became our lifeline. Alexander could express comfort, curiosity, and even frustration without a sound. We began to understand him in ways the doctors hadn't predicted. And the parents, once lost in their wealth and expectations, began to grasp the profound truth. Alexander wasn't broken, he simply communicated differently, and those who listened closely could finally understand. It was early morning when the father finally stayed long enough to witness something extraordinary. Alexander was awake, small fingers fluttering across the crib mattress, experimenting with vibrations, tapping rhythms that seemed to pulse through the room. I had shown him the basics. Now he was creating his own patterns, discovering ways to communicate that no one had taught him. And so I stayed, quietly, observing, learning. Alexander didn't respond to voices, but he responded to movement, to intention, to presence. I discovered that when I approached slowly, letting him feel my approach through the floor, through vibrations in the crib, he would calm. When I rushed, when others tried, he stiffened. Doctors called it coincidence, reflex, stimulation, but I knew better. I had seen children like him before. Children for whom silence wasn't emptiness, but a language waiting to be spoken, and I was going to be the one to speak it. Every night, after the mansion hushed and its lights dimmed, I would sit by his crib. No words, no clapping, no snapping, just my hands on the crib rail, my palm on the mattress, steady rhythms, slow vibrations. When I tapped gently, Alexander would turn toward the source. When I stopped, he would relax. And for the first time, I saw a spark, a tiny flicker of understanding, recognition, and trust. By the time he was 6 months old, the word deaf had solidified in the house. It shaped conversations. It shaped distance. His father stopped asking questions. His mother's hope flickered, and the specialists were brought in, machines and charts replacing intuition. But I observed what the world around him didn't. Alexander understood presence, connection, and rhythm in ways no doctor could measure. One afternoon, a nurse dropped a stack of books. The clatter should have startled him. It didn't. But when I pressed my hand gently to the mattress, Alexander immediately turned to me. In that moment, I knew the world was not ready for him. Not yet. But I was, and I was going to make sure he thrived, even in silence. It happened quietly, almost imperceptibly, one evening when the mansion had settled into its usual hush. Alexander lay in his crib, eyes wide but still, fingers twitching at the edges. I placed a small, broken music box on the mattress, a device that no longer played sound, only vibrations. I wound it slowly, letting its subtle tremors travel through the fabric beneath him. At first, nothing. Then a tiny movement. His fingers curled, then relaxed. His lips parted in what could only be described as a laugh, soft, breathy, almost disbelief itself. The first sound of joy in the room since the diagnosis. No one else noticed. The father was in the study, buried in papers. The mother had stepped away for a moment. I was alone with him, and that moment was ours. I held my breath. This wasn't a reflex. This wasn't coincidence. Alexander understood the vibrations. He felt the rhythm. He reacted deliberately. And for the first time, I knew with certainty that he wasn't lost to the world. He simply experienced it differently.
The father noticed. At first, he was cautious, hesitant to confront authority. But slowly, he began questioning the restrictions. "Why is she being moved away from my son?" he asked one evening, his voice quiet but firm. "Why are these experts dismissing what we see working?" The mother, exhausted yet determined, spoke softly alongside him. "Because they don't understand," she said. "They can't see what he feels, only what they expect him to do." Alexander seemed aware of the tension. He stopped tapping, stopped smiling, pressed his forehead to my arm in silent protest. He had begun to understand the undercurrents of authority in the house, recognizing when he was being pulled away from the one person who truly communicated with him. It became clear. The quiet resistance was not just about me. It was about the house itself, the systems and structures that had dominated for decades, now challenged by a child who could not hear, but could profoundly feel. Every whisper, every sideways glance, every report questioning the methods was a test of our bond, our patience, and our determination to let Alexander flourish on his own terms. And I would not step back. Not now, not ever. The tension reached a breaking point one afternoon. The lead specialist arrived with a report in hand, her tone professional but rigid, suggesting a return to traditional therapies and schedules. "Your child needs structured auditory training," she insisted, "not unconventional methods." Her eyes flicked to me, filled with doubt and barely concealed judgment. The father, who had been observing quietly, stood up slowly. The usual air of control and authority lingered around him, but something had shifted. His confidence no longer came from power, but from understanding. "Stop," he said, voice calm but unwavering. "We are not going back. Not now, not ever." The room froze. Specialists and staff alike blinked in surprise. The father, once distant and detached, now spoke with the certainty of someone who had finally seen the truth. "She," he gestured toward me, "understands Alexander in ways none of you have, and he responds every single time." I stayed silent, letting him take the lead. He continued, "I've watched my son flourish through rhythm, touch, and presence. He doesn't need to be forced into noise or schedules that ignore who he truly is. We will continue like this until he chooses otherwise, not because anyone demands it, but because it works." The specialist's face tightened. "This is highly unorthodox. You can't dictate his life," the father interrupted sharply, his patience now firm, his protective instincts fully awakened. "Not after seeing the progress firsthand, not after witnessing what he understands and responds to. You are advisors, not arbiters of his growth." Alexander, sensing the energy shift, reached out, tiny hands curling instinctively toward his father. The man knelt beside the crib, and for the first time, their connection was visible to everyone in the room. The specialists stepped back, unsure how to proceed. Authority had shifted from wealth and experience to presence and understanding. The mother smiled softly, tears welling in her eyes. She reached over and pressed her hand against Alexander's, and he responded instantly, his small fingers curling around hers. The room, once filled with the quiet hum of machines and whispered doubts, now held a charged stillness. Something unspoken had taken hold. Love, patience, and respect overruled convention. From that day on, the father became an advocate, not just a bystander. Every session, every decision, every intervention now went through him first. The staff realized that resistance would no longer succeed. Alexander's world would be built on understanding, and anyone unwilling to adapt would have to follow or step aside. It happened on a quiet morning. The sun filtered softly through the nursery windows, casting warm light across the crib. Alexander was awake, alert, small fingers exploring the textured mattress beneath him. I stood nearby, observing, ready to guide, but this time he didn't wait for me. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed himself up, wobbling slightly on unsteady legs. The mother gasped softly, realizing he was attempting something new. The father, leaning against the wall as always, froze, hesitant, unsure, yet curious. Alexander's eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on each of us, searching, assessing, deciding. Then was a confidence that seemed both instinctual and learned. He stepped toward the father. Tap, pause, tap. The rhythm was clear, deliberate, his own creation. He pressed his tiny hand against the father's chest. The man froze, overwhelmed by the significance. Alexander's first independent act of communication was not a sound, but a movement, a message. I choose you. I see you. I trust you. The mother knelt, tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched the father's reaction. He bent down slowly, placing his hand over Alexander's, feeling the vibrations, the pulse, the rhythm that had become their language. A connection formed in that instant, a bridge built without sound, without commands, without expectation. The staff, witnessing this unprecedented moment, understood the shift had gone beyond training or therapy. Alexander was no longer a child to be guided at every step. He was a teacher in his own right, demonstrating how presence, attention, and respect could transform even the most rigid household. From that day forward, Alexander initiated more movements and interactions on his own. He explored the nursery with confidence, tapping, pressing, signaling in ways no one had taught him, but everyone now understood. His father followed, learning, adapting, responding with care and patience. The mother mirrored their actions, reinforcing the language of trust, and the house, once filled with doubt and hierarchy, had become a sanctuary of understanding, rhythm, and love. Alexander's newfound independence didn't just affect his parents, it rippled through the entire mansion. Staff who had once whispered behind closed doors now watched in quiet awe, realizing that the child they thought needed correction was teaching them patience, observation, and understanding. The head housekeeper, previously rigid and dismissive, began to change. She observed Alexander's small movements, the way he responded to gentle pressure, to rhythmic taps, and to intentional pauses. Slowly, she began adjusting schedules, allowing the child more space to explore, more time to create his own patterns. Efficiency no longer meant speed, it meant presence. Nurses and therapists had to adapt as well. No longer could they rely solely on conventional auditory or behavioral methods. They began paying attention to subtleties, a shift in Alexander's posture, a flutter of his fingers, the way his breathing changed when someone approached. Even the specialists, skeptical at first, began to acknowledge that Alexander's progress was unprecedented. The father became an active participant, guiding the staff with quiet authority. Let him explore, he instructed. Observe, don't intervene. He communicates in ways we didn't understand before.
Respect that. For the first time, the mansion felt like a collaborative environment rather than a hierarchy of control. The mother, rejuvenated by Alexander's growth, became more confident in advocating for his needs. She rearranged rooms, added textures, created quiet corners for reflection, and mirrored the gentle rhythms that Alexander responded to. The home, once sterile and mechanical, was now alive with intention, care, and subtle communication. Alexander thrived in this environment. He began experimenting with patterns, discovering new ways to signal, to explore, to interact. His small victories, tapping twice, pressing firmly, pausing for acknowledgement, were celebrated quietly but profoundly. Every corner of the mansion carried lessons learned from him, and every adult in the house was slowly becoming a student. It was a late morning when Alexander stepped out of the nursery on his own for the first time. The mansion's corridors, usually bustling with hushed voices and careful steps, suddenly felt different, lighter, slower, filled with anticipation. The father and mother followed at a cautious distance, watching closely. Alexander's tiny feet tapped rhythmically on the polished floors, his fingers brushing against the walls for guidance. Every step was deliberate, every motion intentional. Staff paused in their duties, unsure whether to intervene or let him continue. The child had grown beyond being a passive participant. He was now an explorer, confident in the language he had created. When he reached the drawing room, the father knelt to meet him, offering a hand, but Alexander didn't take it. Instead, he pressed his palm against the floor, paused, then tapped twice. The vibration transmitted through the polished wood, reaching the father's hands resting on the floor. A smile spread across the man's face, a mixture of astonishment and awe. The mother watched, tears welling in her eyes. "He's doing it," she whispered softly. "He's reaching out on his own terms." Alexander turned slightly toward her, pressing his hands against her knees and then stepping back, establishing a rhythm they had all come to understand. Staff began noticing subtle changes too. Nurses realized that Alexander responded more to intentional presence than to toys, sounds, or structured sessions. The household slowly adapted. Floors were cleared for movement, corners softened with textures, and adults learned to communicate with patience, observation, and rhythm. By the time he reached the main hall, Alexander's presence transformed the space. His steps, taps, and pauses created a rhythm that everyone unconsciously followed. The mansion was no longer just a house of wealth and authority. It was a living, breathing space shaped by the child's understanding of connection, sensation, and trust. Alexander's growing independence began to reshape the routines of the entire household. Staff who had once relied on schedules, rules, and authority now had to pay attention to subtle signals, adjusting their actions to accommodate his unique way of communicating. The head housekeeper, initially skeptical and resistant, started observing Alexander closely. She noticed the small but consistent patterns, the way he tapped, pressed, or paused to indicate needs or preferences. Slowly, she rearranged cleaning schedules to avoid disrupting his rhythm, creating spaces where he could explore safely. Nurses and therapists began to adapt too. Traditional methods were replaced with observation, gentle guidance, and intentional presence. They learned that forcing responses or relying on machines often hindered Alexander's progress, whereas patience and attention allowed him to flourish. Every small interaction became a lesson in respect, understanding, and timing. Even specialists who had once dismissed my methods began to take notes, carefully documenting his responses to touch, vibration, and rhythm. They started recognizing that Alexander's abilities were not deficits, but different strengths. The mansion, once a place dominated by rigid schedules and authority, was now shaped around his growth. The father, proud yet humbled, oversaw these changes. He ensured that Alexander's environment supported independence rather than control. Meetings were rescheduled, activities slowed, and every adult in the house was expected to respect the child's unique communication style. The mother, equally attentive, reinforced this approach, teaching staff to mirror gentle movements, maintain calm energy, and engage with intention.
The mother watched carefully, understanding immediately. "Let him guide this," she whispered to the father. Alexander's small hands pressed firmly against the floor, pausing to gauge the adult's response. Each tap was deliberate, almost commanding. He was asserting control, not through sound, not through anger, but through intention. The father knelt, feeling the vibrations. His eyes widened as he realized that Alexander was dictating the flow of his own day. The child wasn't defiant, he was teaching them to listen differently. The staff quickly adjusted, letting Alexander explore the nursery and approach meals and activities on his own schedule. This was a turning point. Alexander's challenges forced the household to rethink every routine. Meals, therapy sessions, and playtime became flexible, adapting to his needs and responses. Adults had to slow down, observe carefully, and respond with intentional presence rather than authority. Alexander's confidence flourished. He learned that he could influence his environment safely, and the adults learned that control was less important than connection. The mansion, once rigid and hierarchical, was now fluid, responsive, and shaped around a child's perspective. A profound transformation for everyone who lived there. Over the following weeks, Alexander's emotional expressions became more deliberate, more profound. What once was subtle, a shift in breathing, a twitch of his fingers, now carried clear meaning, revealing his thoughts, desires, and feelings to anyone who had learned to pay attention. One afternoon, the mother sat on the floor, arranging soft cushions for Alexander to explore. He crawled toward her, pressed his tiny hands against her knees, then lifted his head, eyes meeting hers. He paused, then pressed once more, longer this time, as if emphasizing trust and connection. The mother's lips trembled, tears filled her eyes. She had never felt a bond this strong, this immediate, this deep. The father, observing quietly from the doorway, realized that Alexander's emotional language extended beyond the nursery. Every gentle tap, every deliberate pause was not only communication, it was a form of expression that conveyed comfort, curiosity, joy, and even subtle frustration. Alexander began initiating interactions with both parents. He would crawl toward the father, place a hand on his chest, and tap a rhythm that indicated a need for attention or reassurance. Each time, the father responded, kneeling beside him, mirroring the taps, establishing a conversation built entirely on touch and vibration. The child's laughter, quiet but unmistakable, became the soundtrack of the house, replacing the mechanical routines that had once dominated it. The mother noticed another change, Alexander's empathy. He began responding to emotions he could sense. If someone in the room was anxious or tense, he would pause, press a hand gently, and adjust his own actions to provide calm and reassurance. It was as if he had become the emotional compass of the mansion, teaching adults how to feel through observation, intention, and connection. By the end of that week, the house felt transformed, not just structurally but emotionally. Alexander had woven himself into the rhythm of every adult present. His presence demanded patience, awareness, and empathy. The parents, humbled by the depth of his intelligence and emotional insight, began to understand that connection was more powerful than correction, that observation could teach more than authority. Alexander's growing independence and emotional clarity began to ripple beyond the nursery, subtly reshaping the dynamics of the entire mansion. What had once been a household driven by hierarchy and routine was now guided by observation, patience, and presence. The father, who had spent years relying on authority and control, found himself adapting in ways he never imagined. Meetings were postponed, schedules shifted, and even small decisions, like where to place furniture or how to organize rooms, were influenced by Alexander's needs and rhythms. His presence became a quiet reminder that power was secondary to understanding. The mother, energized by Alexander's responses, began to collaborate with staff more intentionally. She coached nurses and therapists to observe rather than instruct, to respond with care rather than urgency. Her own confidence grew as she realized that her child's abilities were not limitations, they were lessons. Staff members, initially resistant, now recognized Alexander's influence. The head housekeeper adjusted schedules to allow uninterrupted exploration. Nurses developed new approaches to therapy, and even security staff began moving with awareness, ensuring their footsteps did not disrupt the child's environment. The mansion, once filled with rigid structures, had become fluid, responsive, and alive. Alexander's impact extended to small but powerful moments of family connection. He began signaling when he wanted both parents present, pressing hands simultaneously against their chests, establishing a rhythm that required collaboration. The father and mother learned to synchronize their movements, listen to each other, and trust their child's guidance. In doing so, they discovered that parenting wasn't about control, it was about connection. Even social interactions began to shift. Guests visiting the mansion noticed subtle changes. Conversations slowed, patience increased, and the family exuded a calm that contrasted with the usual rigid precision of wealth and authority. Alexander, without a single word, was teaching everyone around him that empathy, observation, and presence could transform relationships in ways money and power never could. The day of Alexander's first milestone celebration arrived quietly, but the air in the mansion buzzed with anticipation. It wasn't a party in the conventional sense. There were no loud decorations or overwhelming crowds, but rather a gentle acknowledgement of his growth and independence. The mother had arranged soft cushions, tactile toys, and safe spaces for exploration. The father adjusted the environment subtly, ensuring that every surface, every object, allowed Alexander to interact safely and meaningfully. The staff moved carefully, aware of the delicate balance between supervision and freedom that Alexander required. Alexander, dressed in comfortable clothes, explored the room with cautious excitement. His small hands pressed on the floor, tables, and fabric surfaces, sending vibrations that were now second nature to the adults around him. Each press, each tap was intentional, a language the family had learned to understand and respond to. The parents knelt beside him, guiding only when necessary, letting him lead the interactions. Alexander's laughter filled the room, not loud, not demanding, but rich with joy and discovery. The mother's eyes glistened with tears as she observed her child's delight, realizing that he had taught her and everyone in the house the profound power of patience, observation, and understanding. Even the father, once rigid and distant, smiled softly, a mixture of pride and humility in his expression. Alexander pressed his hands gently against his father's chest, signaling a desire for closeness, and the father responded, kneeling down, matching his movements. The synchronization of their rhythm, child and parent, felt like the first genuine conversation they had ever shared. That evening, the mansion felt transformed. The staff, once cautious and skeptical, witnessed a child celebrated for who he was, not who he was expected to be. Alexander's first celebration became a testament to the family's growth, their adaptation, and the deep bonds that had formed through quiet observation and deliberate connection.
Alexander's influence had begun to extend beyond his parents. The staff, once hesitant and skeptical, now found themselves learning from him daily. His taps, presses, and deliberate movements had become a language everyone in the mansion had to understand, and in doing so, he was teaching patience, observation, and emotional intelligence. One morning, a new therapist arrived, unfamiliar with Alexander's rhythm-based communication. She attempted to follow standard procedures, speaking loudly and using equipment to elicit responses. Alexander froze, tension rippling through his small body. The mother quickly stepped back, allowing the child to guide the interaction. Alexander pressed his hands on the floor and tapped a deliberate rhythm. The therapist hesitated, unsure how to respond. Slowly, she placed her hands where he indicated, letting him feel her presence. His body relaxed, and a tiny smile appeared on his face. The father, observing quietly, realized that Alexander had become the instructor. Each staff member had to learn not only patience, but how to truly observe, interpret, and respond to subtle cues. The mansion's approach to care shifted entirely from conventional techniques to Alexander's own methods.
Even specialists flown in with the most advanced technology were amazed. Alexander ignored machines that beeped and flashed, but responded instantly to intentional touch, rhythm, and vibration. He demonstrated to the experts that understanding did not require sound, it required awareness, presence, and careful observation. By the end of the day, a transformation had occurred. The mansion's staff, the parents, and even visiting specialists were no longer teaching Alexander. They were learning from him. He had become the quiet leader, showing that intelligence, empathy, and connection could manifest in ways the world often overlooked. Time passed, and Alexander's world and the mansion had completely transformed. What had begun as a silent struggle had become a language of presence, rhythm, and touch understood by everyone in the household. The family had learned to listen in ways they never imagined. The father, once obsessed with control and perfection, now measured success in connection. He no longer demanded obedience or expected immediate compliance. Instead, he observed, mirrored, and adapted. His relationship with Alexander was built on mutual understanding, trust, and subtle cues that transcended words. He had discovered humility, patience, and the depth of a father's love. The mother flourished as well, no longer weighed down by anxiety or fear of her child's limitations. She moved through the mansion with confidence and joy. Her bond with Alexander was profound. Every tap, every press of hands on the floor or mattress became a lesson in empathy, patience, and communication. The mansion was no longer a house of rules, it was a sanctuary of understanding. The final test came one evening when the family gathered in the nursery. Alexander initiated an interaction entirely on his own, a series of taps and presses that conveyed joy, curiosity, and love. Both parents responded, kneeling and mirroring his movements. For the first time, the entire family communicated without words, without schedules, without instructions, just presence. In that moment, the mansion was silent, not empty, but alive with connection. The parents exchanged a glance, understanding fully the lesson their son had delivered. Alexander had not only adapted to the world, he had reshaped it. He had taught them how to truly hear, how to truly see, and how to truly connect. The world outside the mansion expected silence, limitation, and struggle. Inside, Alexander had created a language of touch, rhythm, and empathy. The child once labeled death had become the teacher of his family, and in doing so had rewritten what it meant to listen, to love, and to understand. And as Alexander rested that evening, hands resting on his parents' chests, the mansion hummed quietly with the invisible yet undeniable power of transformation. A child had spoken without sound, and the world had finally learned to listen.